Thank you very much. I've been told I have 20 minutes, but my most important slide is at the end, so I hope I can go to that one without rushing through. First of all, I would like to thank this opportunity to come here and show a little bit of research that we've been doing at the OECD, which I think is very timely for the current setup or changes that are taking place in LEPs. And what I want to do today is to provide to you a very short but dense presentation with the main items that I think could be useful to you. And this presentation accounts for some analysis that we've been carrying at the OECD for about 3 or 4 years already. And in this analysis, there was a study that was financed by the former Northern Way that were very helpful for their contribution, and it has emerged into a very interesting research agenda where we have the city regions of Manchester, Leeds, and Newcastle's participating. So I'll mention a little bit about that project, how that's coming along. It's in its final stages, and it will be launched at the end of the year. Then I would also like to talk about the links between the regions and the aggregate. This is something that has caught a lot of attention to European leaders, members of the OECD, is to think about regions as relevant places for economic development. The factors that we find are most responsible for bringing growth to places in our analysis. And then at the end, I'll talk about the policies and the institutional. So I think the interesting part will be the final part of my presentation, the most relevant, that some of the lessons that you can take out of this presentation. But I think it's important to go through a lot of the analysis that we observe, what is the key elements that really drive development in places over the medium and long term. And in this context, I would like to use examples from the other OECD regions that we see, some of the things that appear to be working, and also the database that we and the analysis that we've carried. So without further ado, let's start with what we see as the main patterns of growth across the OECD regions. And here's a graph that displays the rate of growth of urban and rural regions. And what we see is that there's a big cloud. There appears to be many urban regions that are growing faster than rural ones, but also vice versa. There's many rural regions that appear to be outperforming urban ones. So this graph is very simple, but it's very powerful because it tells you that there's not a unique solution to development. It's not about becoming concentrated and urban that will ensure that places have sustained patterns of growth. It also means that regions that are perhaps rural can do very well, can be competitive, can kind of really perform above the OECD average. So then we kind of decompose a little bit the cloud, and the next graph shows the patterns of growth in rural regions, and we do find this trend of convergence. It appears that many of the rural regions are catching up to the OECD average, and the same pattern is present with what we call intermediate type of regions. Now, if we look at the urban regions, their performance, there's both agglomeration forces and convergence forces. And here we've done a lot of analysis trying to understand why some urban regions eventually decelerate in their performance. It's not just about becoming dense, becoming urban. There's many other issues that are relevant to driving performance in urban places. So there's a very, very mixed pattern that we see out there when we measure these growth trends. Next, I'd like to talk about the links between the regional and the aggregate dimension. And in here, it's important to not think in terms of growth rates, but actually where the growth happens is important. For example, if we think of a national economy as an engine of growth, then the regions are the pistons, and their contributions to growth depends both on their size. Larger regions will have a larger contribution just because they represent a larger share of the economy, but also on how fast they grow. You can have a place that is not very large, but if it performs very quickly, it might have indeed almost the same contribution as a larger place that doesn't grow that quickly. So it's combining these two elements that gives us what we call the contributions to the aggregate growth. And this is very useful to quantify, to have an understanding of what's going on the aggregate picture. So when we plot the contributions to growth in a graph, we get sort of a strange curve, which we call it a power law. And in this power law, there are very few regions that have a disproportionate contribution to growth. And these regions are the big hubs. You can see across all the OECD, that's California, Texas, Washington, Paris, London, are amongst these big hub regions. But then you have many regions in the fat tail. And the interesting part is that the tail continues. So individually, these many regions do not contribute much to aggregate growth, but all of them are quite relevant. Now, what does this mean? If we quantify the effects, it appears that there's a 1/3, 2/3 rule. That is, the large engines of growth, they contribute to about 1/3 of aggregate growth. But if you combine everybody else, they're even much more relevant to the aggregate picture. This is something that national governments are starting to pay a bit of attention, because it's not about social policies or transfer mechanism, but it's actually about potential for the aggregate. And it's a potential that implies that development should be pursued in all places, not just in any particular one, but in all places. This is very recent work that has caught a lot of attention across the OECD. Now, one interesting finding is that these types of relationships appear to occur within countries. That's what we call scale-free in different patterns. And if we show the picture in the UK, you do find the same scale. You do find that London dominates the national growth, but you have a lot of the intermediate type of regions like Manchester, Leeds, that are quite relevant. They're right there in terms of the aggregate picture. And then you have many regions that combined are quite important to the aggregate. Now, if we just do a very simple exercise where we compute the contribution of what we call lagging regions, that is, regions that have a GDP per capita below the national average at a given point of time, let's say 1995, and we compute their aggregate contribution over a 12-year period, we find that about 44% of the aggregate growth is driven by lagging regions. That's a substantial part. And in fact, in the UK, this percentage is even higher. So when the people from the national government tell you London is the engine of growth, well, actually, yes, it is critical and important, but there's a much more relevance if you combine everybody else together to the aggregate picture. This carries important policy implications because, like I mentioned before, thinking about policies aimed at lagging places is not about a social policy. It's not about a transfer policy, but it's actually economic policy. It's a policy that can have a significant impact on the aggregate. And I think I'll talk about later how many countries are shifting towards this mind gear. Now, I showed to you a heterogeneous growth pattern, forces of convergence, forces of agglomeration. I've told you that it's not about concentrating. That's not the key element. There are some problems with many cities that we observe in the OECD. And then, what are the main factors? That's something that we started to analyze. And how did we do this? Well, we use these type of econometric models that I will not in detail explain what they mean, but they're actually pretty sophisticated ways that we have to measure what are the main drivers of growth at the regional level. And there's a wide range of them. I just put 3, but it's a very interesting research agenda we started some years ago. Now, what do these models tell us? First of all, the most critical factor that appears in all the models is that human capital always has a positive impact on growth. Human capital, both the presence of high-skilled labor and the absence of low-skilled labor. So both forces drive growth in regions. Second, infrastructure has a positive impact on growth, but by itself, it doesn't have any impact. Only when human capital and innovation are in combination with infrastructure, does it bring growth to the region? That's a critical finding that tells us that these things have to be in conjunction. By themselves, they don't affect growth, but once they enter in conjunction, they have a significant and positive impact on growth. We also find that agglomeration forces contribute positively to regional growth. We find that the accessibility of a region and its distance to external markets also has a significant impact on growth. But mostly it's the human capital, the key element that we find in our analysis, in all these sophisticated regressions. We do have pretty good evidence on that. Now, an interesting finding is that these things depend on the level of development of regions. And here's where this project has been very useful to us that we started with the 3C2 regions. That is, as regions move up into the development stage, different elements appear to be relevant for their performance. So when regions are what we describe as lagging, meaning that they have low levels of development, it's about human capital and what we call capital deepening. It's about infrastructure and connectivity, getting the basic building blocks in place. Then as they move higher into the development stage, which we see at B, it's about their ability to absorb people into the labor force. And obviously this is done through a dynamic business environment. And then when they are what we call leading regions, it's all about innovation. That appears to be the key element once regions reach higher levels of development. Their competitiveness, it's mainly driven by innovation type of policies. It's a very simple picture, but it gives sort of an idea of how to start thinking about prioritizing these kinds of elements. It tells you that if you want to be an innovative hub, first you need to have your key building blocks in place. Otherwise, it's not going to work.